Here in the social sciences at UCLA, movements for social justice motivate many of our researchers to gain a better understanding of the forces that shape the world around us. We're in a society now where large segments of the population have very little faith in our most central institutions. And throughout our history, we've seen various social movements and uprisings that were provoked by instances of injustice. The work we do here in the division hopefully will empower communities, community-based organizations, to lead the challenge towards a more just future.
The impact of mass incarceration in Los Angeles, as its impact across the country, is that it sucks up all the resources in the bank, in the public sphere. And all of our public dollars are going to policing and incarceration when the vast majority of people that we're arresting are being arrested for public health crises. What does it mean when we take those dollars out of policing and incarceration and move it over into housing, move it into summer jobs for young people, and so on? Los Angeles operates the largest jail system, some say in the United States and others say on Earth. So I have the opportunity here to be in the belly of the beast, to really look from the inside out. I also really appreciate being here at UCLA because I do feel that this is a university that values this kind of applied, activist, action-oriented research. And so I've had the opportunity here to thrive in my career in ways that I'm not sure I would have done at other universities.
I'm often asked about the anti-immigrant rhetoric that seems so pervasive. And what I like to share with students and with other colleagues is what we do best on our campus, which is to double down on empirics, on data, on evidence about immigrants and their impact. In that same way, we also push for solutions. So I think what makes UCLA stand apart, in particular, is the Division of Social Sciences. And this is where we can engage in all components, if you will, about immigrant lives, immigrant work, immigrant culture, immigrant food, all the multiple contributions and nuances that they bring to our society. I think all of this is what makes the work that we do in the division so unique, as well as so important. The ability to do analysis in a multidisciplinary fashion, and perhaps more importantly, to push for equity and to push for social justice. My name is Abel Valenzuela, and I'm professor of Chicano Studies and Central American Studies, Labor Studies, and Urban Planning.
My name is Kelly Lytle Hernandez. I'm a professor of History, African American Studies, and Urban Planning here at UCLA.
My name is Darnell Hunt. I'm Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA, Professor of Sociology and African American Studies. If you'd like to learn more about the cutting-edge, community-engaged scholarship here, please subscribe to our e-forum, LA Social Science. Good afternoon, or good evening, good morning, wherever you may happen to be with this remote event. Welcome to our Dean Salon. Today we're talking about ethnic studies at UCLA, scholarship for social justice. You just saw, you were the first people to see our new video, our promotional video for the division, one of 3 that we're producing. That one, of course, on movements for social justice. So today, of course, we want to talk about the legacy of ethnic studies at UCLA, where we've been, where we are now, where we're going. UCLA is distinctive among its peers in the sense that it has 4 outstanding academic units representing the 4 major racial and ethnic groups. Of course, we have American Indian Studies, we have African American Studies, we have Asian American Studies, and we have Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies here at UCLA. So it's really my honor now to introduce to you, my colleagues, the chairs of each of these units. First up, we have Randall Akee. He's chair of the Interdepartmental Program in American Indian Studies. He's an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy and American Indian Studies. He previously served as the David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Key is an applied microeconomist and has worked in the areas of labor economics, economic development, and migration. He is a fellow at a research fellow at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development and serves on the University of California Office of the President's Native American Advisory Council. He has also served on the National Advisory Council on Race, Ethnic, and Other Populations at the US Census Bureau. Next up, we have Natalie Masuoka, who's chair of the Department of Asian American Studies. Her research interests include racial and ethnic politics, immigration, political behavior, and public opinion. Her first book, The Politics of Belonging, Race, Public Opinion, and Immigration, co-authored with Jane Junn, examines how and why whites, Blacks, Asian Americans, and Latinos view immigration and immigrants in systematically different ways. The book was the winner of the 2014 Ralph Bunche Award by the American Political Science Association. Her second book, Multiracial Identity and Racial Politics in the United States, explores the rise of Americans who self-identify as mixed race or multiracial and the impact on politics. This book was recognized as the best book in political behavior by the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. Next, we have Leisy Abrego. She's professor and chair of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies at UCLA. An immigrant from El Salvador, she has been accompanying the immigrant rights movement for over 20 years. She teaches and writes about Central American migration, undocumented youth, and the intimate ways that US immigration policies affect immigrants' lives. She is the author of Sacrificing Families, Navigating Laws, Labor, and Love Across Borders, co-authored with Cecilia Mejilar and Leah Schultzbar of Immigrant Families, and co-editor with Genevieve Negron-Gonzalez of the new book, We Are Not Dreamers, Undocumented Scholars Theorize Undocumented Life in the United States. And last, but certainly not least, we have Cheryl Keyes, who's the chair of the Department of African American Studies. She is the author of Rap Music and Street Consciousness, which received the Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Book Titles. Professor Keyes' work in hip hop studies is recognized among peers as the first ethnographic study on rap music. She appeared as a critic in the television miniseries documentary Death Row Chronicles on BET, and as a cultural consultant for DreamWorks Animation's film Trolls World Tour. In the area of performance, Professor Keyes is a pianist, a flutist, a singer, and composer with an extensive list of credits. She also won an NAACP Image Award in the category of Outstanding World Music Album for her debut CD, Let Me Take You There. All right, so welcome everyone. Looking forward to the conversation today. So let's start out by talking a little bit about history. Let's get a sense of how we got to where we are, how these units came to be. Can each of you just give me a few words about sort of the history of your respective units, how they were formed? Just a couple of minutes, just to kind of give us a sense of how they came into formation here at UCLA. Why don't we start with Leisy in Chicano Studies and Central American Studies?
Sure, thank you, Darnell. So our department as it stands now was initially a research center in 1969, moved into becoming an interdisciplinary program, an IDP in the 70s, and then existed kind of with not a whole lot of funding for a while. In the early 90s, there was danger of it being cut, and there had to be quite a bit of student and community activism to keep it going, so that finally, after a 14-day hunger strike, the chancellor at the time agreed to make it a department, and that's what we are now. Can we
pull up one of those images, image 4, and maybe have Leisy say a few words about that. So,
yes.
So what are we looking at here?
So as I've had a chance to read about the history of the department, there was quite a bit of activism, apparently every single day for a month. Students from all over campus, from all different communities, were having a number of civil actions, taking over spaces on campus, and finally, at one point being arrested because they came into the faculty center and stayed there. The police was called on them, several were arrested. finally, it took the 14-day hunger strike that ended that series of activities that finally led to the settlement that the department would be created. And I love to show these images in class because I remind students that it was students just like them that did the work for us to have the space that we have on campus. And I think that's a call to them and also a form of empowering them to realize that their voices matter and that collective action works.
Yeah. What about image 5? Let's take a look at that too really quickly here.
Yeah, these were one of the participants of the hunger strike. It was a water-only hunger strike that lasted 14 days with support from all over the city. There's an archive that includes the letters from community members, from Hollywood actors, from all kinds of people that got involved, demanding the space for us to continue to be on this campus.
Right. Well, Cheryl, I'm looking at the background there, your background. And obviously that's referencing a very important image here at UCLA. Can we pull that up, image number 1? I'm sorry, image number 2?
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about this image and its significance at UCLA, and in the process, a little bit about the history of the Department of African American Studies and how it came to be?
Yes, thank you very much, Dean Hunt, for your question and actually for my being invited to participate in this important and historic moment. I'd like to just, first of all, mention that the particular photo that you see is actually a mural. It was like a 10-foot, 27, it was a humongous mural that was actually, and it's called the Black Experience, and it was a part of an expressive project amongst Black fine arts students, African-American fine arts students, in the aftermath of the Kent University school shooting, which of course was in the 1970s, May 4th. And these students felt that it was necessary to come together to express themselves, express what it is like to be African Americans at UCLA in the US. And amongst the 7 artists, and you can see it's in my backdrop as well, included Marion Brown, Neville Garrett, Andrea Hill, Jane Stoltz, Joanne Stewart, Michael Taylor, and Helen Singleton. And of course, it was to actually just come together at a time when it was also following a tumultuous events of protests, even here in Los Angeles. And this was a way to say, hey, this is part of our Black experience now. And interestingly so, the mural was eventually covered over, believe it or not, for many, many years until 2013, when it was restored. And it took about a few months as part of bringing it back to life. And this mural can be seen right at the Ackerman Union A level, which is next to Panda Express. And in 2014 is when the artists that they were able to bring back, who they were able to find at the time, which of course was Neville Garrett and Miss Singleton, to come and really celebrate this restoration of the Black experience. And what is interesting about the photo that you can't quite see, or the mirror, I might say, that you can't quite see, and you can see it more live and vividly if you were to visit it at Ackerman Union, is that you will notice behind each of those students and their photos as captured in the mural stand historical figures, African-American leaders such as Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, among other images. So please, whoever out there, definitely come and see this historic mural that celebrates Black experience, not only here at UCLA, but here, period, in the US of A, beginning in the 70s, as was expressed in this mural. As far as, yes.
No, I was going to say, your department history coming out of what's now called the Bunch Center. It was the Center for Afro-American History and Culture originally, but then it became the Bunch Center eventually.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that timeline.
Sure. African American Studies began here at UCLA roughly around 1969. And it was emerging out of a time of students' protests around the country, where Black students joined in with activists demanding the majority of white-controlled universities to begin offering courses in Black studies. And of course, in '69, at the charge of, I would say, with the chancellor then, Charles Young, had decided to take on this particular mission. And by doing so, he had invited and recruited Dr. Claudia Mitchell Kernan, who at the time was at Harvard University and a social linguist, dealing with and addressing Black language and vernacular or African American sociolinguistics. Now, at the time, African American Studies, or the center in which there were several directors, but Dr. Mitchell Kernan happened to be one of the directors who was really much long-lived, and ended up with the organized research unit called Center for Afro-American Studies, as it was called then. And as we now know, the Center of African American Studies, CAS, has been renamed in 2003 in honor of the Nobel winner, activist scholar, Ralph Bunche. So
and
now
UCLA alum. And UCLA alum.
Yes, and a UCLA alum.
Yeah.
So nonetheless, what had happened is that under the charge of CAS, it established African American Studies in the various academic activities, including several programming areas, research, library publications, and special projects. And before you know it, around 1974 is when we begin to see the development of the African American or Afro-American Studies interdepartmental program.
Yep.
And then from '74 all the way up to 2014, during this period, African American Studies initiated an undergraduate major in '74, a master's program in 1980s, and then, of course, African American Studies minor in 2000, as well as an MA JD program, the first in the nation, which was created in 2003. At this juncture, of course, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the late Dr. Mark Sawyer, for he was instrumental in creation of UCLA's Department of African American Studies in 2014. Mm-hmm. And so around 2014, and I was actually at that time a member of the legislative assembly in which they had to vote on it. So I was there. I happened to be a member as I was representing my home department. So it was in 2014 when African American Studies was officially departmentalized, going from the IDP to becoming a department. And I stand as a predecessor. I would say my predecessor was, of course, Professor Marcus Hunter of Sociology. Before him was Cheryl Harris, School of Law. And again, the first chair of the Department of African American Studies was Professor Robin D.J. Kelly of History. And I'm mentioning these particular areas because it's something I want to say once we get to the point about the interdisciplinary nature of the department.
Thanks, Cheryl. Why don't we move on to Randy? Can you talk a little bit about American Indian Studies? And can we pull up image number 11?
So I think, you know, the common theme that you hear from everyone is that we have this common origin story of 1969 when the various studies centers were created, and American Indian Studies comes from that exact same tradition. Here's a photo of the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969. There were dozens of UCLA students who traveled up there and participated in the occupation. This was during a period of activism, specifically around the American Indian movement, AIM, and establishing, you know, sort of, again, following and inspired by and in conjunction with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And our students from UCLA were, you know, an integral part of this and continued on to, you know, in the 70s as the American Indian Studies Center was established with the addition of 5 FTEs. And then by 1982, the first academic program was created. It was the master's program in American Indian Studies, which is the first in the nation. So it's something for us to be very proud of. In the 90s, we began a bachelor's degree and a minor program as well. And we also have an MA-JD program now as well. So yeah, in particular, we started off in very similar ways to the other three ethnic studies centers and programs. We are the last remaining program that has not departmentalized. However, the good news is that we are smack dab in the middle of that process of converting over to becoming a department as we speak. And we are very anxious to do that. And our colleagues are quite supportive, as are our faculty and students.
Great. What about image number 12? We have Zoom challenges here. Zoom can be complicated from time to time.
Absolutely.
Well, while we're doing this, can you tell me a little bit about the Mapping Indigenous LA project?
Sure. So I'll just give you a quick overview. One of the projects that we're very excited about that engages community as well as scholars is a project headed by a number of scholars at UCLA, Professor Wendy Teeter, Professor Mishana Goman, Professor, multiple professors. And what it does is it really sort of takes Los Angeles and California landscapes and reimagines and allows community members to identify places that are meaningful to their communities. Again, just naming places, putting up, yeah, so this is the website, but really sort of in the era of native erasure, especially in the Los Angeles basin, it's an attempt to reimagine and re-envision the physical landscape as being an indigenous place, showing overlapping names and titles of places, of village sites, is a new project, and it's done in an interactive manner, such that there are videos, there are images, there are songs about these various places that we know as Westwood, that we know as Santa Monica, that we know as downtown Los Angeles is actually a native village, Yanga. So there are lots of these really interesting things that is a real sort of integration and collaboration between scholars and native faculty and community members at UCLA, but also in the community as well.
Image number 7, can we get to that one? I know
you're asking for a lot.
I know it's a complicated process, but we're gonna make it work. There we go. So Natalie, what are we looking at here, and what does this have to do with the history of Asian American studies at UCLA?
So as we've learned here, that all 4 of these centers were created in the late 60s. Asian American Studies, like our other sister programs, really began as a student-led movement. Students were really inspired by the movements of the times, the civil rights movement, the Third World Liberation Front, and the San Francisco State student strike, which is the longest student-led strike in history. They were also reeling from what they really seeing as anti-Asian sentiment out of the Vietnam War, and really seeing the missing piece, right, which is how Asian America and Asian Americans fit in American history and American politics and society. And so we see here students' activism and protest here on UCLA campus, advocating for courses on the Asian American experience. What this picture here is recognizing here that while there were sometimes 1 or 2 classes being offered, it wasn't necessarily a curriculum or a consistent set of classes that were being offered on campus. And so there was repeated student protests demanding for a more consistent curriculum on Asian American studies.
Great. And what about image 8? Can we see that one as well?
Yes, here we can see students marching in front of Campbell Hall. And this is a really, I think, a great picture of showing the multiracial and cross-racial protest movements that were happening at UCLA at the time. One of the things that we are really proud of at UCLA is really our leadership in the field of Asian American studies. The term Asian American was actually coined by UCLA scholar Yuji Ijioka, who was one of the founding faculty of the Asian American Studies Center in 1969, was a leading scholar of the Japanese American experience. And we're really thinking, right, about how it is that a diverse set of national origin groups from China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, really at that time, could really think of themselves, right, as a collective community that is subject to a specific racialized experience. And we're really at that time labeled as really using terms like Oriental, these terms that really didn't necessarily convey an actual humanized, that offered a humanized and personal experience here of what Asian Americans were going through. And so there was a lot being done at this time, not only thinking about what was being talked about in our curriculum, but really how the community thought about itself, right? Described itself and thought of itself as a collective yet diverse community with a collective but shared set of interests.
Sure. It becomes clear from this conversation that each of these units was a pioneer in its own rights in terms of your respective fields and sort of coining terms that are associated with the field today, with seeding areas of research, et cetera. And they all emerged at a particular point in American history, coming out of the 1960s, which sociologists have referred to as the Great Transformation, this period of shift from individual rights to a focus on group rights and social movements, the whole bit. A lot has happened in 50 years. Here we are in 2021. Can you talk about the contemporary relevance of what you do in your departments, kind of building on that history? Anyone want to take a bite of that apple?
I can start and say that I wish it were true that racial injustice was over. It's not, and it's evident in so many areas of life that white supremacy continues to be an organizing principle in our society and in the world, really. And so in our department, we are all about trying to understand and think about solutions for the kinds of inequities that we continue to see, right? Right now, we know that the communities that we work with and write about and teach are the very folks who have been hit so hard by COVID, for example, are the very same communities that are caged at the border right now, right? These things continue to happen, and there continues to be a need to tell stories, to analyze inequalities, to understand the structures that organize our lives by centering the very communities that are excluded and harmed in our society, right? In all of those ways, we saw in particular the previous president really center Mexicans and Central Americans as problems, as people who were, trying to take advantage of this country. And though our new administration isn't using those terms, right, still wanting to center what are the experiences that continue to allow for the inequities to happen. So in all of those ways, and at the same time recognizing, understanding the resilience, the continued resistance of these communities is what our department is about.
Others?
Well, in the area and in the Department of African American Studies, it continues to also do similar things in which Professor Abrego just mentioned, and that we definitely discuss. Our classes deal with the global conversations around contemporary social movements, such as obviously Black Lives Matter, and our importance in being at the helm of this conversation. And of course, coming out of the Trump era, if I might say, which was totally devastating to all of us here who are part of the ethnic studies units and underrepresented groups in many respects. We have built a kind of department that deals with this throughout classes, that address this, even address globally. One of the things I didn't mention when we talked about the development of African American studies here at UCLA, even when it was cast, it was always dealing with things like the hemispheric and diasporic dimensions of the Black experience.
Yeah.
So we're there, and we, of course, it's obvious with the pandemic. You're also looking at environmental injustice, the health disparities, you name it. We address all of those aspects that affect the lives and the livelihood of African Americans, Blacks all around the world, globally. So the department continues with its studies and with its and encourages this kind of curriculum, that it stays contemporary, that it's interdisciplinary, and that it also is cross-disciplinary in addressing social issues and social justice of Blacks around the world.
Yeah, Randy, Natalie, you guys have any thoughts about kind of contemporary relevance of what you do, given your extensive histories?
I definitely would agree with Professors Abrego and Keyes that I think many of these issues related to social justice and representation, I think are thinking about how we move into the future. But I think I want to also interject that while it's been a long history of ethnic studies here at UCLA, and we're very lucky on our campus to have a long history of this discourse and talking about representation, that I think what we've realized is that for many other parts of our country and the world, there really is a lack of knowledge about communities of color, our histories, what we've gone through. And one of the important things that we continue to play a leadership role in is offering the general public a historic and contextualized way of understanding current events. Right. So looking at, for example, we're thinking of in the perspective of Asian American studies, looking at COVID and the rise of anti-Asian bias because disease was connected with China, right? Thinking about the violence that happened, unfortunately, in Atlanta last week, that these things aren't necessarily these unique circumstances that we're dealing with in 2021, 2020, but that this is really a long history of struggle, of white supremacy, right, of power. And I think it's important for us to continually offer historical, right, and assessment about how deeply institutionalized a lot of the challenges that we continue to struggle with. So I think we also, as much as we also look forward, we also think about the importance of history in our context.
Yeah, absolutely. Randy.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I mean, clearly, I think a lot of the things that indigenous peoples, communities, nations face exactly along the lines with my three colleagues have just mentioned. And I think that's what makes UCLA, unique in that we have these research centers and departments on top of it that focus on these various communities, and there's so many overlaps and similarities as Professor Abrego was talking about, right? There are indigenous peoples coming from Central and South America and Mexico, and they're being, part of the reason they're being displaced because of sort of environmental impacts, as Professor Keyes was talking about, and it's happening domestically in the United States. And all of these issues, we all share them in various ways. So there are these various overlaps. In the current environment, sure, as you heard from my other colleagues, COVID-19. Why is it that certain indigenous communities, American Indian communities in particular, were so hard hit? Why wasn't there infrastructure there? What is the legacy of, sort of the colonial, settler colonial history of America, that it's such that there are vast swaths of communities that don't have running water in 2021, right? These are the kinds of questions that I think we do the analysis of. We have to bring these points and to light, and that's what our scholars do here. That's what we do jointly, separately, collectively, as a community.
Yeah, in fact, I want to pick up on some themes that have emerged from your respective comments. So on the one hand, we know that these are interdisciplinary units. They're composed of scholars who are humanists, who are social scientists, perhaps in the arts. What's unique about these units? What can be done in these units that, say, couldn't be accomplished in traditional academic departments like sociology, anthropology, public policy, political science, or whatever? I mean, what's the value added here?
One of the things about when you talk about the traditional departments, so to speak, is that it's the politics in those departments where the voices, the importance of research by non-white scholars are not given that type of respect in the kind of forum and the platform. So I just find it, personally, for myself, such a refreshing opportunity to be able to come in a department, to be a part of a department where my work resonates because it has one central thing: African American studies or the studies of Black life, the diaspora, the states. It has that. And that's not often the same when you are in departments that have, first of all, they weren't a lot of these disciplines weren't created by people of color. And so they still have this kind of canon, this kind of way, this element of exclusion, where you don't have that kind of conversation that you could have when you are engaged in departments, ethnic study departments, that address exactly that cultural area in which you are a scholar or have studied. So that's one of the things I find: a sense of freedom, a sense of democracy, something that you don't get anywhere else.
A certain focus that you can't have in other departments that are taking on a range of other types of tasks. Anyone else have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I can say, as someone who was trained in a traditional discipline, that what feels particularly useful and important about being in my department now is that I can unapologetically center social justice for Latinx folks in my work, in all the work that I do, in my teaching, in my research, in my service, in ways that are really devalued in traditional disciplines, because the ways that we approach research, what we value in terms of, ideas of objectivity, in terms of ideas of theory, right? We can move that aside and really center the praxis. We can center wanting to do work that matters outside of a handful of journals in our field, right? We care about using the tools of academia, about using the researchability in ways that matter to the very people that we hold ourselves accountable to in these communities that we're working with and representing in the work that we do.
In my comments at the opening, I said that UCLA was somewhat distinctive in having four long-standing units focused on the major racial ethnic groups in American society. Many of our peer institutions may have a Department of Ethnic Studies, for example, that tends to be, interethnic, where multiple groups and the parallels between those groups are studied. What do you think about that strategy, as opposed to the strategy that we pursued here at UCLA, where we don't have a Department of Ethnic Studies? Do the departments kind of work together to fashion interethnic research? What are the pros and cons of taking either approach from your point of view?
I'll just jump in real quick. I mean, I think it provides a depth of knowledge and experience that is is incredibly useful. And so, I feel as if there's been a huge investment in, we could use more, but I feel like it's been a huge investment in these different departments, such that when we need to and when we want to do these collaborations, there are more than enough people. There are people that are trained just like me in African American studies, in Asian studies, in Chicano studies, right? There are my counterparts. It's not just a one-off. There are enough of us we can do it sort of. I can slice the pie in multiple ways. I can, only look at social scientists across the board. I can look at all the people doing indigenous studies, American Indian study. We can, pick and mix and match. And I'll just, again, give you one very explicit example from a project that American Indian Studies has done collaboratively, is the Carrying Our Ancestors Home, which was the job of figuring out how to repatriate ancestral remains and artifacts that the Fowler Museum has had for generations. We're proud to say we, as UCLA, faculty from the law school, faculty from archaeology, anthropology, the humanities, all got together with admin at UCLA, and we're able to we've returned something like 92% of the artifacts, right? Berkeley, the other schools, they still have, warehouses type situation, right? And that's the kind of stuff that collaboration allows you to do. What's the problem? Well, legally, we have these issues. Historically, and we have these issues. We jointly come together and solve this long-standing hurt that the institution, the university, has inflicted on people, for instance, right? And that's something that I think having that wealth of knowledge, sort of repositories in different parts of the institution, has been invaluable.
Yeah, that's great. And that's a very, very clear example of one benefit. So we began this conversation by talking about movements for social justice, and then we talked more broadly, and a number of you have mentioned social justice as being an important sort of value that motivates the work that happens in your units. Can you talk a little bit about concretely what social justice means to you and how that plays out in terms of the teaching, research, and service that happens in your units? Maybe Natalie, you want to start us out on that one?
This was a tough question, but an important one. Thanks, Darnell. I think when I think about social justice, and I think in generally, for all of our units that think about social justice, I think I'll take the frame of the social in the social justice, which is thinking about how inequities are so deeply rooted in society that it really takes us as a collective community, right, as a society, to rectify the deep injustices that we find. And so this is really not necessarily about kind of individual acts or actually even pointing the finger at specific individuals for the assignment of problems, but really thinking about how we all come together for better equity and for justice.
Great. Anyone else have any thoughts about that? Cheryl, I think you're muted. Are you muted?
Oh, I was just saying, well stated. Definitely, when I think of social justice, I think of our need to continue to demand equity, to demand parity, to demand the erasure of a supremacist kind of mindset. And that's what it means, gentrification. We're dealing with these issues, trying to dismantle what is beginning to invade certain communities of color. Also, the health disparities issue continues. You can see how it pervades when you're dealing with COVID-19 and who has, which groups have the higher incidence of, as Professor Akee was saying, incident of the pandemic that's been affected mostly by that. Also, policing, police brutality, all of the things that we're seeing now. And I may be a little senior than some of my colleagues, but I remember, growing up in the Jim Crow South, and I thought all of that stuff was finished. And here again, we have the 21st century. But I must say that it's great to see movements now that are not just populated by that are not homogeneously populated. But now you're beginning to see this cross section, intersection of Black, Brown, of American Indian bodies, Asian Americans. Everybody's coming together to put a halt to this.
I think some of the images,
I love that.
Yeah, and some of the images that we saw from some of the early marches in the late 60s, early 70s, clearly multicultural, multi-ethnic, and that's been kind of the approach here at UCLA for more than half a century now, which I think we can all be proud of. Others, Randy or Leisy, do you have any thoughts about that, the whole social justice piece and how that plays out in your units with respect to teaching, research, service?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a central part of what, and my colleagues, we all do it in different ways. I agree with what my colleagues have said so far. And I think for me, I also think of social justice as a commitment to the dignity of people, a commitment to their well-being, and to a recognition of their full humanity. And that allows us to think about all of the various pieces that we're working on, whether it's something like health inequities, but also even representation in popular culture, right? So the gamut is wide and broad, and our colleagues are working to understand those things, to teach those things, to do it in the service that we do, not just on campus, but with community organizations in the city, often even nationally and internationally, to think about using the tools that we have as academics to shed light on how we get to a point of dignity for everyone.
Yeah. Randy?
The last thing everything everyone has said is exactly right. And I think the last thing that, that I'll add to it, I think, is sort of the respect and understanding of tribal governments and tribal sovereignty, indigenous people sovereignty, and how that plays a role in the treatment and the well-being of indigenous peoples, not just in the United States, but in multiple countries. And I think that's an additional layer of social justice that is becoming, there's a fruition of it. And I think understanding that some of these nation states, the more that there are additional concerns that have to be recognized. And, I think we're all in, and it's something that in our faculty and our colleagues and our students, we're seeing an awareness that is, and an awakening, let's say, that is quite new. And it's in partnership with, post-colonial studies, critical race theory. These things sort of evolve and intersect with each other and, diverge in different ways and different dimensions, because they have to. They're not exactly the same. That's why they're called different things and they're in different, but nevertheless, there's this synergy that our students thrive off of by engaging it in these multiple ways. And that's one of the unique things that I think, to me, makes, sort of research and teaching in social justice so exciting, especially at a place like UCLA.
Well, you anticipated where I was going to go, Randy, and that was our students. Why do our students choose to major or minor in your units? What do they do with that when they graduate? Anyone want to take a stab? And what do we know about our students in terms of why they choose African American studies or American Indian studies or Asian American studies or Chicano studies, Central American studies? Why do they choose those majors or minors to begin with? And then what do they go on to do with that when they leave UCLA?
But I know that there are students who are pre-med students, and they are encouraged, and I'm glad to hear this, they're encouraged, you should take courses to understand people other than yourself. And we highly recommend that you take a course in Asian American Studies so you can understand the people, their ethos, their traditions, culture, you name it, African American Studies, Asian American Studies, American Indian Studies, or Chicano Studies, and Central American Studies. You got to do this because if you want to work with people, and this is something that I think is quite essential. You want to work with people. You want to work in the medical field. You got to understand the people who you will end up meeting and treating. And so students take it because of some of those who are conscious about that. Others also who are from these ethnic communities. And it's a place where they can come and feel at home and learn more about themselves. So that becomes a mission of discovery and a sense of belongingness that many other students who are from these ethnic communities or underrepresented communities find that ethnic studies courses help to fulfill this.
Sure. Anyone else have any thoughts about this? What do you know about your students and the experience they have in your programs?
I think given the history of activism in our units, so many of our courses are community engaged courses. That is that so many of our courses involve local organizations, local community leaders in LA County or outside of California. And so we offer this special opportunity for students to truly not only connect with the greater community, but understand how to create projects, how to think about leadership that services the broader community. And so I think this is a really special part of what our ethnic studies units offer to students is really that true connection.
Yeah.
Right, with the communities that we are trying to represent, and that we're trying to ensure, I think, appropriate research and understanding about.
Yeah, and Randy, I know this must be top of mind for you as your interdepartmental program moves toward departmentalization. So, what are your thoughts about your students in terms of what they're going to get from this new department?
Well, one of our students, has just become the Secretary of the Interior. So, Deb Haaland is a UCLA alum. She spent a little bit of time at UCLA. So, there's some big shoes to fill there. And our other students go on and get PhDs, they go to law school. We have many graduates go to work for their tribal communities. They work in tribal government, they work in tribal agencies, housing, education. So we see them go all over the place because, again, UCLA draws all these people from all different parts of the country, and many of them go home, many of them go on to graduate school. So we've seen that we see them take the major in our undergraduate major and go on to doctorates or other graduate programs, and in our master's program we've also seen them go directly into government service of various types. So yeah, we're very proud of them.
Great. Leisy?
Yeah, I will say that it's not a secret among my colleagues that one of my favorite things of this job is working with students, and particularly in my department, because there is this kind of magical sense of recognition that happens in the classroom that for most of our students, they haven't witnessed prior to coming into UCLA, and particularly into these classes, because they haven't been centered in the way that they are suddenly, making the connections between their lived experiences and these terms that we're talking about, and being able to explain, oh, that's why my family's here, or that's why, so many things suddenly start to make sense for them because they weren't covered in their K through 12 curriculum, right? So it's this magical connection that we're able to build, and they will say that that's what attracted them. Even if they thought they were just taking this one class, they end up minoring or majoring because it is, like Professor Keyes mentioned, right, a way to feel a sense of belonging while on campus. And then I love when they stay in touch, right? The recommendation letters, and then years later, the folks,
all the wonderful things they're doing.
All the wonderful things in city government, in education, in law, in medicine, in so many different fields. And I love especially the emails from students who weren't even majors. They took just the intro course and they remembered that quarter that they took that class that then led them into a path they hadn't considered before. And they just want to reach out and thank me for, all of us, right, in our classes, that we help them make these connections that then very clearly help them understand their life in the city or in the society.
Yeah, that's real. That's real. So we're about 2 minutes away from the hour. This could go on forever. Why don't we just, from each of you, we'll just go around really quickly. Any final thoughts or observations you'd like to share with our viewers before we wrap this up? Maybe we'll start with Natalie.
I think looking forward, for Asian American Studies, we have the unique perspective to, as a unit that gets to exclusively think about our communities, to also think about really ways in which there are parts of our communities that have really not been given their fair share of attention. So thinking about, for example, Southeast Asian communities, Pacific Islander communities, and we have a lucky chance to think about how our community connects with Arab American communities, especially as we think about to what extent, how Asia is thought about broadly, but also thinking about the ethnic studies curriculum, and to what extent where do we place Arab American studies. And so we think about the really exciting ways in which our communities become more diverse. That's really opening up a lot of new and engaging opportunities for us.
Great,
In
Randy.
the future.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think our big horizon is departmentalization. So we're really looking forward to that. We are in the various stages of it. And I think for us, it'll be a game changer, as it was for others, because it means that we will have faculty members that are wholly within our center and not also sort of, at other parts of the university. So I think that is something that we're really eagerly anticipating, and being able to offer a wider diversity of classes for students coming up.
Great. Cheryl?
Well, the Department of African American Studies is very exciting right now, for we are doing a lot of new classes, building on the strengths of our faculty. But we're also a part of the Rising to the Challenge, which main purpose is to, of course, bring faculty, hire faculty at the assistant professor, associate, and at a full professor levels, perhaps, who engage with the study of Black life and Black experience. So that's something that, with our interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary focus, we are quite excited about the rising to the challenge, if I can use it that way.
Absolutely. Leisy, take us home here.
I'll just say that as a Salvadoran immigrant and a scholar of Central American studies, for me personally, what's been exciting is that our department expanded its name. In fall 2020, it became official that we're now Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies. There's no other department like it in the country, and it was really our colleagues and our students working to reflect the reality of who we are, particularly in this part of the world, right? These are the communities that we work with. These are the students in our classrooms. We just got approved for a minor in Central American Studies. And so it feels like a moment of growth and inclusion.
All right. Well, I'd like to wrap everything up by thanking my colleagues for joining us today and sharing the histories of their units and the amazing work that's happening. And you can certainly see from their comments why in the division our motto is engaging LA, changing the world. That's what they're doing. Thank you to all of our viewers. Be safe, and we'll see you soon.